I'm Nellie Szilagyi-Benedek, Deputy Director for Education and Programs at the Jewish Museum, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this evening's lecture by Eric K. Ward. The Salo W. Barone Program has been endowed by the trustees of the Salo W. and Jeanette M. Barone Foundation, whom we thank for their generous support of the museum's public programming. This event is held in conjunction with the exhibition Draw Them In, Paint Them Out, Trenton Doyle Hancock Confronts Philip Guston, on view through March 30th. If you did not have a chance to visit the galleries tonight, we encourage you to please come back and do so. We still have a number of related programs coming up this season, including on next Thursday, February 13th at 6:30, when we are hosting a screening of the beautiful and evocative short film, The Ballad of Philip Guston, and Thursday, March 20th at 6:30 p.m., when we will listen to a conversation with authors and creators whose work demonstrates the importance of storytelling in Black and Jewish communities across various disciplines. For full details about all of our upcoming programs, please visit our website, where we encourage you to sign up for our e-news. Now, I would like to introduce our speaker. Eric K. Ward, Executive Vice President of Race Forward, is a notable civil rights leader known for his innovative approaches to combating white nationalism and anti-Semitism and advancing racial justice. The only American recipient of the Civil Courage Prize, Eric has over 3 decades of leadership in community organizing and philanthropy, and has worked with leaders from government, law enforcement, labor, business, and social movements to advance civil rights work. Eric has emerged as a national leader in the fight against authoritarianism and organized racism, including anti-Semitism. His groundbreaking research and work has been featured in acclaimed documentaries, such as Viral, Anti-Semitism in 4 Mutations, and We've Been Here Before, What the Punk Scene Can Teach Us About White Supremacy, shedding light on the complex dynamics of hate and extremism in modern society. We will be screening a short clip from We've Been Here Before tonight at the end of the program, so please note that the film contains depictions of violence, including neo-Nazi imagery, as well as images of Jewish stereotypes, if these images will be triggering for you. I heard Eric speak at a conference on anti-Semitism hosted by the Council of American Jewish Museums about a year ago. What struck me about his presentation, what was unique about it, was the way he had tied together 2 strands that I have always heard addressed separately, and they are combating anti-Black racism and combating anti-Semitism. After hearing him speak, I knew that we had to try and bring him all the way from Oregon to the Jewish Museum, where this sort of deep thinking about the whys and how of community building is always uppermost in our minds. This presentation is also timely given our current exhibition, which also foregrounds how racism and anti-Semitism are intertwined. Now, please take a moment to silence your cell phones and join me in welcoming Eric Ward.
Good evening, everyone. It is wonderful to see faces that I know and new faces in the room as well. I wrote last week, some images won't let us look away. They haunt, provoke, and demand something from us. That's the power of Draw Them In, Paint Them Out. Trenton Doyle Hancock confronts Philip Guston. It's an exhibition that wrestles with history, identity, and the weight of symbols. It forces engagement by asking hard questions about what it means to confront bigotry through art. For me, art is one of the most powerful tools of collective memory. It captures moments in time. It reflects the struggle of marginalized communities, and it shapes how history is remembered. But what happens in moments when art itself becomes a battleground? When symbols once meant to expose oppression and bigotry and othering become co-opted by the very forces they sought to critique. When those who challenge bigotry are attacked for daring to raise the difficult and nuanced questions that strengthen a democracy. I looked through the catalog and today walked through the exhibit wondering, can art help us understand how present-day anti-Semitism, racism, and white supremacy will shape not just our politics, but also our cultural memory? If so, what will get remembered? What will get erased? And most critically, who will get to tell the story? For me, art has never existed in a vacuum. It speaks not only to the world I walk in, but the larger one around it. For Philip Guston, a Jewish painter, I believe his world was not much different than mine. He turned the hooded specter of the Klan into a reckoning on canvas. His paintings weren't just about the Klan as a historical terror, but they were also about the ways in which organized racism and bigotry seep into everyday life, into our communities, our institutions, and even our own reflections. After nearly a decade of Trumpism, we have failed to ask the question, how have we absorbed Trumpism into our own lives? We still treat it as an aberration, something that others engage in, rather than something that has moved from the margins to the mainstream. In Draw Them In, Paint Them Out, Trenton Doyle Hancock, a Black artist, and in my opinion, a visionary one, takes that reckoning further. He unravels, he evolves, and he reshapes the story. His work reminds me that history is never static, that confronting racism and anti-Semitism is not a one-time act, but a continuous necessary struggle of belonging and othering. Tonight, they've given me 45 minutes, and I apologize in advance, to lean into that discomforting discussion rather than retreat from it. It's because we believe history demands that we engage these questions and that we engage them now. I start with a fundamental question that I've asked for decades. Who is an American and what is America becoming? These are two fundamental questions at the heart of the debates we see playing out today. These are not new questions. They have been at the heart of every major conflict in this country's history. The Revolutionary War, the Civil War, Reconstruction, the Civil Rights Movement, Black Lives Matters. The debates over immigration, policing, and voting rights, they are the moments that define who belong, and just as importantly, who does not. So are the inevitable backlashes that come with each moment. These are also questions that have never had static answers. Who was considered an American in 1790, when the first Naturalization Act restricted citizenship to free white persons? Who was considered an American in 1865, when the Civil War ended and the 14th Amendment promised birthright citizenship? Who was considered an American in 1924, when Native Americans, whose ancestors had been here for thousands of years, were finally granted U.S. citizenship? Who was considered an American in 1965, when the Immigration and Nationality Act overturned racist and anti-Semitic quotas and opened America's doors to those fleeing persecution and people from Asia, Africa, and Latin America? And today, who is considered an American? When voting rights are being rolled back, when Black and Latino communities face aggressive voter suppression, when both Jews and Arabs are vilified as outsiders, and when immigrants who have spent decades building their lives here are now in constant fear of deportation and vigilante harassment. The answer, historically and in the present, belonging is always contested. Now, some would say an American is someone who loves this country. But what does it mean to love a country? Does it mean blind allegiance? Or does it mean holding the country accountable to its highest ideas? Others might say being an American is about contributing to society, working hard, paying taxes, and serving in the military. But if that were true, would we see millions of immigrants who do just that denied a path to citizenship? Would we see the children of undocumented parents who have known no other home treated as though they do not belong? It needs to be said once more. The reality is that America has always been defined not just by those who belong, but by who is excluded. America is changing. It always has been changing. And yet, every time a new wave of people enters the conversation about belonging, there is a backlash. Every time an older wave of people demands equal protection under the law, there is a backlash. Why? There are those who view demographic change as a threat rather than an evolution of common identity. There are those who see multiracial democracy not as an aspiration, but as an existential crisis. This fear is not new. It's the same fear that fueled the Chinese Exclusion Act in the 19th century, the quota systems of the early 20th century, and the violent resistance to the civil rights movement of the 1960s. I want to be clear. That anxiety is the same fear that led white Southerners to enact Jim Crow laws after Reconstruction, desperate to maintain their power in a society where Black people had begun to claim their rightful place. And today, it's that same fear that drives the Great Replacement theory, a white nationalist-driven anti-Semitic conspiracy theory, falsely claiming that white Americans are being replaced by immigrants and people of color, and that the masterminds are Jews. It is the fear that animates the attacks on diversity, equity, and inclusion, the book bans, the political efforts to erase realities of racism and bigotry from our history books. It is that false claim that places immigrants, the trans community, Muslims, Jews in harm's way. But I believe America does not belong to those who fear its evolution. It belongs to those who shape it, who struggle for it, who insist on a democracy that is truly multiracial, inclusive, and just. Black and Jewish communities have always found themselves at the center of that debate. Both have been treated as perpetual outsiders, despite being woven into the very fabric of this nation. Blacks and Jews have fought together and separately for a vision of America that is more just, more equitable, and more inclusive. But we have also found ourselves at odds, sometimes manipulated into seeing each other as adversaries rather than as co-conspirators for justice and the best aspirations of this society. Sometimes this manipulation is deliberate, it's strategic, and it's old. Divide and conquer tactics have been used throughout history to prevent solidarity between marginalized communities. We see it in other ways as well, that political leaders pit different groups against one another, suggesting, for example, that addressing anti-Black racism comes at the expense of addressing anti-Semitism, or vice versa. We see it in the ways that both Black and Jewish communities are scapegoated during economic crisis, blamed for the problems they did not create. We see it in the ways that anti-Semitism is dismissed as not real racism, and that anti-Black racism is minimized by those who insist that the struggles of Jewish people in America ended after World War II. But we also see a long history of solidarity. We see it in the alliances forged between Black and Jewish activists during the Civil Rights Movement. We see it in the Jewish lawyers who risked their lives to fight against Jim Crow in the South. We see it in the Black leaders who continue to speak out against anti-Semitism, refusing to allow it to take root in our communities without apology. This is the America that Black and Jewish leaders, not all, have fought for. Not an America of division, but an America of shared struggle. So let me revisit once again those two fundamental questions at hand. Who is an American, and what is America becoming? The answer depends on us. It depends on whether we allow fear to define our national identity, or whether we commit to America that is big enough, strong enough, and just enough to include everyone. The fight over these questions is not abstract. It is playing out in our schools, in our legislators, and in our neighborhoods. It is playing out in who is allowed to vote, who is allowed to tell their stories, and who is allowed to belong. America is still becoming. And the real question is, what will we make of it? How we tell stories matters. And how we tell each other's stories will matter more over the next years and decades. Satire has long been used as a weapon of the oppressed. We laugh so we don't cry. We mock power to strip it of its mystique. We use humor to endure, to survive, and to resist. From the Jewish satirist of the Shtetls who ridiculed the czar, to the Black comedians who exposed the absurdity of Jim Crow, satire has been a means of resilience and resistance. It has allowed marginalized communities to speak truth to power in ways that direct confrontation could not. It has created space to challenge racism and bigotry without immediately triggering repression. In comedy clubs, underground newspapers, and even on mainstream television, satire has provided a sharp critique of those in power, often under the guise of laughter. But satire is also dangerous. It can cut both ways. What happens when those same images meant to expose oppression are used to reinforce it? When symbols that were meant to challenge racism or anti-Semitism are reabsorbed into the very systems they critique? This is the fundamental paradox of satire. The intention of the creator does not always determine the interpretation of the audience. History is filled with examples of satire that began as critiques of power, but ended up reinforcing the very stereotypes they sought to dismantle. The most infamous example is the tradition of the minstrel shows in the United States. Originally, some minstrel shows and performances were created to expose the hypocrisy of white supremacist attitudes. But instead of critiquing racism, they became a key vehicle for entrenching it. The exaggerated, grotesque caricatures of black people in minstrel performances were embraced by white audiences, not as satire, but as entertainment. The same is true of many anti-Semitic images that circulated in European political satire during the 19th and early 20th centuries. Some artists sought to expose the ridiculousness of anti-Jewish conspiracy theories by exaggerating them in drawings. But instead of recognizing the critique, some audiences absorbed the images at face value. The grotesque depictions of Jews with hooked nose, controlling world events, became part of a deeply rooted anti-Semitic visual culture that persisted long after the original satires were gone. Guston's Klansmen are a perfect example of that tension. He painted them not just as external figures of hate, but as self-reflection, in acknowledgement of our own complicity in a system built on white supremacy. He forces us to ask, are we laughing because it's absurd, or are we laughing because it's true? His paintings are uncomfortable, not just because they depict Klansmen, but because they blur the line between condemnation and participation. His work reminds us that white supremacy is not just an external force. It is something that exists within society, within institutions, and within individuals. But here lies the danger. What happens when the next generation of viewers does not understand the critique? What happens when satire loses its context, when it's stripped of the intention that originally shaped it? Does the image remain a challenge to oppression, or does it become part of the visual language of hate? Satire can be a weapon, but satire can also be a trap. We have seen how racist caricatures, originally meant to critique, were embraced instead. This is the double-edged sword. It depends on the audience understanding the joke. And in 2025 America, not everyone does. When satire is effective, it punches up. It exposes the contradictions, hypocrisies, and the absurdities of those in power and those who would use bigotry to elect themselves and unelect others. But when satire is misinterpreted or co-opted, it can be used to punch down, reinforcing the very ideas it was meant to dismantle. That's why satire must be wielded carefully. It must be accompanied by context, by explanation, by an awareness that once an image is released into the world, it no longer belongs solely to the creator. It becomes part of a cultural conversation, and that conversation and its meaning can be twisted. As we examine satire's powers and pitfalls, we must ask, how do we ensure that satire remains a tool for justice rather than one of oppression? One answer is education. In both of these artists, what you see is the teaching of historical context in their pieces. It exposes how satire has been manipulated in the past, and it ensures that the messages behind these satirical works are understood. The other answer is accountability. These artists grappled with the fact that their work does not exist in a vacuum. They understood that satire can be powerful, but also fragile. We, if we are not careful, will lose our vigilance. And the jokes that were meant to undermine this moment could instead become part of its arsenal if we too do not adhere to the lessons of Guston and Hancock. This is the challenge of this exhibit. It demands that we think critically about what we see, about how we interpret images, and how history has taught us what happens when it is misused. Throughout history, we have seen figures from marginalized communities turn to the very ideology that seeks to destroy them. This is when fear leads to mimicry. And I want to talk about this a little bit more. When figures from marginalized communities do turn to these ideologies that seek to destroy them, some do it for survival, others out of deep-seated internalized oppression, and still others because they believe falsely that by embracing that bigoted power, they can bend it to their favor. Two figures in American history exemplified this paradox. One is the name of Lawrence Dennis. The other, his name is Stephen Miller. Lawrence Dennis was a black man who passed as a white man and became one of the leading intellectuals of the modern-day American far right. Born in 1893 in Atlanta, Dennis was a child prodigy, dazzling audiences with his intelligence and his rhetorical skills. But rather than becoming a force for justice, he became one of the most vocal advocates for authoritarian, racialized rule in America. Stephen Miller, a Jewish man, became one of the architects of the most draconian immigration policies in modern U.S. history. Raised in a liberal Jewish household in California, he took an early interest in right-wing politics. As a young man, he admired figures like Pat Buchanan, a political leader known for his anti-Semitic dog whistles and nativist rhetoric. Yet instead of fighting against the forces that sought to exclude people like him, Miller has chosen to become one of his most ruthless enforcers. This is not an accident. As Hancock and Guston warn us, when systems of oppression are powerful enough, they do not just force submission, they can force participation. They make it seem that as though the only way to survive is to embrace the very ideology that seeks to erase you. Lawrence Dennis is a story of tragic irony. He was a gifted orator, a Harvard graduate, a former U.S. diplomat who could have used his talents for civil rights, for uniting America under a democracy, but instead he chose fascism. Dennis's transformation began in the 1920s when he abandoned his diplomatic career to embrace an ideology that was sweeping across Europe, fascism. He saw the Great Depression as proof that democracy had failed. He admired Mussolini and Hitler, believing their authoritarian regimes to be the future of civilization. He rejected capitalism, not because he sought justice, but because he saw it as weak and inefficient. He believed that America needed a strong man leader, someone who could impose order, suppress dissent, and enforce a rigid national identity. I'm sure that does not sound familiar at all. What made his story even more tragic, though, is that he was a black man who had spent his life hiding his identity. Dennis had been born to a black mother, but spent his life passing as white. He never acknowledged his blackness publicly. And in later years, when questioned about his racial background, he dodged the topic entirely. He understood at some level that the very ideology he championed would have no place for him had the truth been known. By the 1930s, as I said, Dennis had become one of the most influential fascist thinkers. He had wrote books advocating for the totalitarian state. He gave speeches arguing that democracy was doomed. He saw racial and ethnic hierarchies as inevitable, even as he sat atop a lie about his own racial background. His commitment to fascism led to a trial in 1944 under the Smith Act, which sought to root out Nazi sympathizers in the US. He was acquitted, but his reputation never fully recovered. By the time of his death in 1977, Dennis had faded into obscurity, a man whose genius had been wasted on an ideology that he had triumphed, which would have turned against him eventually. I believe Dennis Lawrence's story forces us to ask, what drives someone from a persecuted community to embrace the very ideology that will ultimately erase them? While Stephen Miller's story is different, the parallels are striking. Born in 1985, nearly a century after Dennis, into a Jewish family whose ancestors had fled anti-Semitic persecution. Raised in California, he attended progressive schools and had access to privileges that his great-grandparents could have only dreamed of. But Miller was drawn to reactionary politics from an early age. He condemned multiculturalism, argued against bilingual education, and aligned himself with other Jews on the far right, like David Horowitz, who trafficked in Islamophobia and racism. By the time he reached Duke University, Miller was deeply embedded in white nationalist rhetoric. He wrote opinion columns railing against immigration. He defended Confederate symbols. He positioned himself not just as a conservative, but as an extremist willing to go further than most of his peers. After college, he found a powerful patron in Jeff Sessions, the Alabama senator, who was one of the most anti-immigrant voices in the Senate. Under that mentorship, Miller shaped some of the most aggressive anti-immigrant policies of the modern era. With Donald Trump's rise to power, Miller saw an opportunity. He joined the administration as a senior advisor. He shaped policies that directly targeted immigrants, asylum seekers, and refugees. He played a central role in the Muslim travel ban, the family separation policy, and the dismantling of asylum protections. What makes Miller's story most chilling, though, is that he adopted the same rhetoric that historically had been used against Jewish people. He championed the replacement theory, that same white nationalist conspiracy that fueled the deadly neo-Nazi rally in Charlottesville in 2017, led to vicious anti-Semitic mass killings of Jews in Pittsburgh, blacks in Buffalo, and Latinos in El Paso, Texas, and Gilroy, California. He helped craft speeches that painted immigrants as an existential threat, again, echoing similar themes that had once been used to justify violence against Jews in Nazi Germany. He embraced, like Dennis Lawrence, a movement that despised him. He walked into the rooms filled with people who in another era would have refused to sit beside him. He defended leaders who tolerated anti-Semitic voices in their ranks. Why? For Miller, like Lawrence, the answer lies in power. He saw an opportunity to reshape America into something else. He believed that by embracing white nationalism, he can control it, that by wielding its tools, he can direct the energy towards other marginalized groups rather than his own. This warning is part of the message prominent in this exhibition. Not the specifics, but the pattern that feeds our long arc of history. History tells us something, that Jewish and black figures who align themselves with authoritarianism were never rewarded in the long run. The movements they helped to build did not make space for them when the time came. And for Miller, and for those in increasing numbers he represents, I predict the outcome will be no different. Both Lawrence Dennis and Stephen Miller demonstrate how fear leads to mimicry. These stories are about internalized bigotry, about the idea that the only way to survive in a world built on exclusion is to become the enforcer of that exclusion. And to be clear, while at a much lesser degree, these patterns also exist for Jews and blacks on the political left. There are three major psychological mechanisms at play in cases like these. The first is survival anxiety, the belief that if we do not align with the dominant power, that we will be cast out and destroyed. The second is overcompensation, the need to prove themselves more loyal than others, leading them to adopt even more extreme views than their peers. And the third, self-hatred turned outward, the internalization of negative stereotypes about one's own communities, which you then project onto others. The consequences are devastating. It emboldens white supremacy by giving it a token ally, someone who can be pointed to as proof that racism or anti-Semitism doesn't exist. It legitimizes the very forms of bigotry we say we oppose, and it creates a pathway for authoritarianism of all political stripes to thrive under the guise of diversity. For me, this is why this exhibit matters. It exposes these very contradictions. It forces us to wrestle with them. And it demands that we choose a side. Art has not ever been neutral. Trenton Doyle Hancock and Philip Guston are wonderfully inconvenient proofs of this statement, and we should celebrate them for it. Every painting, every piece carries with it a set of values, a perspective on the world, a message, whether intended or not. For Guston and Hancock, I believe that the question is not whether art takes a stance, but what stance will it take and who will it serve? Does it reinforce systems of oppression or does it challenge them? Does it lull us into complacency or does it wake us up? We should honor them by making those our questions as well. We need to hold close that art is a mirror in this moment, reflecting both our realities and our aspirations. It forces us to confront those uncomfortable truths, to see injustice where we may have preferred ignorance. It is also a window into different lives, different struggles, different perspectives that we might not have otherwise understood. Art can bring us closer to people we have never met and experiences we have never lived, helping us forge connections across barriers of race, class, religion, gender, and geography. It allows us to see not just where we are, but where we might go if we dare to imagine something better. Guston and Hancock's arts ask us to confront complicity, not just in others, but in ourselves. It challenges us to see how easily people can be pulled into a system of bigotry and othering, even when those systems are designed to harm them. Their work does not let us look away. It forces us to ask difficult questions. Where do I stand? How have I been shaped by the systems I claim to oppose? And what does it mean for me to resist, not just in theory, but in action? This exhibit is a force that refuses silence. In times of social upheaval, when institutions fail, violence rises, artists are among the first to shine the light on injustice. Artists are the first to call us back into community. Artists are the first to tell us that the only sin is the sin of despair. Consider how during the civil rights movement, photographers and filmmakers captured the brutality of segregation, allowing the rest of the world to see the truth that many tried to ignore. Think of the street murals created in the wake of George Floyd's murder, turning public spaces into canvases of grief, rage, and resilience. Art does not just document history, it intervenes in it. This is why repressive authoritarian regimes fear artists. It is why authoritarian governments seek to censor, suppress, and distort art. Because they understand something that we often forget. Art has the power to shift consciousness. It can make the unseen visible, the forgotten remembered, and the ignored impossible to ignore. It is no accident that book bans are on the rise, that history is being rewritten, that artists who tell inconvenient truths are being silenced. Those in power understand that culture shapes politics, and they know that controlling narrative is the form to controlling the future. Throughout history, authoritarian governments have sought to control artists because they know that storytelling, whether through music, film, literature, visual art, has the power to mobilize people. The Nazis banned and burned books that challenged their ideology. The Soviet Union persecuted writers and filmmakers who dared question Stalin. McCarthy went after filmmakers based off the same premise. Yet today, we see the same tactics at play, not only in government, but within our own social movements, seeking to suppress the debate over historical accuracy in school curriculums. The criminalization of protest is another example, and the silencing of voices that call out systemic oppression. We must recognize this pattern, not just in the past, but now in the present. Because history, I believe, tells us one thing with certainty. Pretending we are the authoritarians will not save us. It will only strengthen the forces that will eventually come for us too. Art reminds us of this lesson. It warns on us. And this exhibit specifically calls on us to break the cycle before it's too late. This exhibit is not just about beauty, it's about truth. It's about accountability, and it's about survival. And if we let it, it can be the foundation upon which we build something better. I promise I'm coming close to a conclusion here. But I'm so moved that I have to continue for a little bit longer. Will you stay with me? I want to share a personal story about confronting hate to build a better foundation. I tell this story often. In the mid-1990s, I was a field organizer for the Northwest Coalition Against Malicious Harassment. One night, I was in Eugene, Oregon for a screening of a documentary called Not in Our Town 2, a documentary by film artists about communities fighting back against hate violence and hate organizing. We had heard that neo-Nazis might try to disrupt this screening event. And sure enough, about a dozen of them, dressed in full Nazi regalia, marched towards the venue. I ushered people inside and stood my ground. At my side was a local rabbi who refused to leave me alone. We faced this group together. Rather than escalate, I engaged them. I asked them questions. I'd like to think Hancock Guston would be proud of me. I asked, who's the Klan? Who here has Christian identity? Who's a neo-Nazi? If you don't understand those distinctions, it's because you are not in the nerdiness of white nationalism. Yet my curiosity disarmed them. Hate often thrives on dehumanization, on the belief that those on the other side are unthinking, unfeeling enemies. But when confronted with direct personal engagement, the certainty of an ideology can sometimes waver. When they finally asked if they could come in, I said, it's a public event, but you can't wear your bandanas. That night, something unexpected happened, but it wasn't really quite that unexpected. A conversation began. The leader of that group, who I'll call Doug, later reached out to members of our community and started to question his beliefs. Then one day, something broke in him. It wasn't an argument that did it. It was his young daughter crying when he turned off Sesame Street because there were too many people of color on the screen. His daughter was inconsolable. In that moment, he realized he had built a worldview that had no place for his own daughter's joy. That was the beginning of his departure from hate. I tell you this story because it illustrates something important. The embrace of authoritarian fear is not inevitable. It is learned, and it can be unlearned. I do not believe every conversation can change a hardened mind, but I do believe that exposure to different realities, the unexpected moments of disruption, can plant seeds of doubt, and sometimes those seeds take root. Art plays this role. That's because it's more than an expression. It is a battleground for memory. What we choose to depict, what we choose to satirize, what we choose to erase, all of these things shape how we understand history, and in turn, they shape the future. Art is one of the few spaces where truth can be preserved, even when those in power seek to rewrite it. In regimes that fear dissent, let us remember artists will be the first target. But let us remember we understand this arc of history, and it is our job to defend artists. Art has a way of lingering in the mind long after this speech or a law or the 2000th executive order is passed. It has the ability to spark both individual reflection and collective action. The stakes of cultural memory in this moment are high. In a time when history is being rewritten, the role of artists have never been more critical. If you control the past, as someone said, you will control the future. If you erase the memory of oppression, you will weaken the resistance to it. And if you deny people their history, you will deny them their power. Art matters. It refuses to let that past be erased. It holds up that mirror, and it forces us to look. It does not allow for easy amnesia. When Philip Guston painted hooded Klansmen in mundane everyday settings, driving cars, smoking cigarettes, standing in groups, he forced us to see white supremacy not as a distant horror, but as something woven in the fabric of daily American life. The danger was not just in the spectacle of cross burning, but in the quiet, ordinary men who sustain systems of inequality and political terror. His art does not allow us to look away. It is a reckoning on canvas. Then comes along Trenton Doyle Hancock, who takes that reckoning even further. He engages with Guston's images, reshaping them, challenging them, inserting his own voice into the conversation. His work does not simply critique, it evolves the narrative, demanding we examine our own relationships to history and the ways in which we either perpetuate or disrupt cycles of hate and authoritarianism. Reinterpret, reframe, reclaim. That is the agency of those of us who have been erased and are forced to reckon with the truths that institutions would rather suppress. We live in an era where collective memory is under attack. Art resists that erasure. It ensures that even when textbooks are censored and politicians rewrite the past, the truth will remain visible. Consider the art created in response to state violence, from the anti-lynching paintings of Jacob Lawrence to the protest murals that cover the cities around America immediately following the murder of George Floyd. Remember, these works do not just commemorate, they call to action. They ensure that names are not forgotten, that those injustices are not buried, that history does not become merely a footnote. So I promise now, we're getting close. If we accept that art is a battleground for memory, then we must ask ourselves, who gets to tell the story? Who decides what is preserved and what is erased? Who decides which statues stand and which are removed? Which narratives are elevated and which are suppressed? The answers to these questions are not just about history, they're also about power. Because what we choose to remember will shape what we become. And if we allow the forces of authoritarianism to erase these histories, if we fail to recognize the ways in which anti-Semitism, racism, and other forms of bigotry are interconnected, we will allow them to flourish in new forms. Artists like Guston and Hancock do the work of memory keeping. Their art does not offer easy resolution. It does not allow us to sit in comfort. Instead, it forces us to wrestle and to act. It reminds us of the long arc and that art will remain one of the strongest weapons we have. So here is my real conclusion. I want to leave you with one more image, a short film that echoes the themes and the contradictions of this moment. It is a film about history repeating itself and of how some chose to respond when confronted, and what happens when the rest of the world abandons you and you must carry that struggle in isolation. As I said, history moves in cycles. The struggle for justice isn't linear. I can guarantee you that my grandparents and my great-grandparents did not struggle through their lives to put me in this exact moment of history to fall down and call it defeat. Rights are won, progress is made, and it will always be met with backlash. Hate is exposed, and then it finds new ways to disguise itself. We see this in every era, in every generation, and yet, within these cycles, there are always those who refuse defeat. Those who will continue to stand up, to resist, and insist on moving forward together. This is an image captured, and we've been here before. It is a powerful film that reminds us that the struggles we face today, that racism, anti-Semitism, rising authoritarianism, are not new. The scales change. The playbook of oppression has remained largely unchanged divide and conquer, instill fear, rewrite history, normalize hate to consolidate power. But just as oppression follows a pattern, so too does resistance. And we've been here before. What the punk scene can teach us about white supremacy is applicable today across society. Throughout history, people have chosen courage over fear. They have organized, they have spoken out, they have refused to be silent. The struggle and the burden of the struggle is ongoing, but so is the fight against it. The question is never about the presence of injustice. The question always has to be about our response to it. This, like the exhibit, is not an easy film. It's a retelling of a story you think you know. But like Guston and Hancock, we choose to own a more complex story. Do we retreat into despair, believing that the forces are too strong to be challenged? Do we abandon all that we have fought for across communities for 75 years? The right to live, love, worship, and work free from fear? This film is a reminder that you are not alone in this fight. Others have come before you, facing seemingly insurmountable odds, and they did not give up. The choices they made shape some of the world we inherit today. And the choices we make when we leave this room will shape the world that comes next. I invite you to watch this film, not just as an ending to this talk, but as a beginning to your next conversation. What will you do with what you have seen and heard this evening? What role will you play in this moment? What will history say about you? What will it say about us? Some images, as I said, will not allow us to look away. They stay with us. They challenge us. They force us to see the world differently. Let's make sure in this moment we do not look away. Let's confront, let's challenge, let's act. Because while we may have been here before, I promise you, we will not stay here, not if we choose to move forward together. Thank you. You're in a moment now that we recognize anti-Semitism, but we won't recognize the thing that's actually fueling it. In a supermarket in Buffalo, New York, a garlic festival in Gilroy, California, at a Walmart in El Paso, the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh. In those cases, Black, Latino, Jews, they were all killed by individuals who believed that they were in a war against the Jewish community. These killers all indicated in their writings that they were targeting these groups because they saw them as puppets, and the puppet masters are named as Jews. The truth is all of those victims died over anti-Semitism. I am not Jewish. I'm Black. I acknowledge that as my primary identity. This society makes it so. But it's not all I am, right? I'm a punk rocker, right? I came up in ska, reggae, skinhead subculture for the most part. September of '86, I break up my band, or at least I leave the band. In typical fashion, right, it got better probably after I left. The band eventually becomes known as Sublime. I was the first singer with Bradley and Eric when we were trying to mix punk and reggae and whatever else sounded good. Folks are really surprised to hear my anti-racism wasn't grounded in a left-right politic or conservative or liberal, right? In Long Beach, all of those existed within my skinhead circles and punk rock circles, right? The difference about the form of anti-racism that I came up in is in my subculture, we wanted to destroy racism, right? Race as a concept, right? We understood that it was a false idea that was preventing our subculture.
I'm a Jewish skinhead. I honestly became a skinhead not because I'm Jewish, but because I love the music. Skinhead's not about race, creed, politics. It's about culture. It's about subculture and sharing that subculture and bringing people together that might not otherwise be together. I think it's the mid to late 80s where shit really got political, where they got to be like neo-Nazis. But prior to that, a skinhead was like anybody.
Yeah. That's how I first came across what's now known as the white nationalist movement. They were Nazi punks out of the suburbs of Orange County who would come into these shows to be disruptive.
It was, if you're a skinhead, you're a Nazi, you're a, racist, Confederate flags, neo-Nazi, that's what you are. And that really was bullshit.
I'm an anti-racist skinhead. Eric is an anti-racist skinhead. Fellow black skinhead.
Skinhead is the most multicultural subculture that I think the world has really seen in a urban environment.
Yeah.
I mean, some of the first skinheads were Jews. And why? Because they were refugees from World War II.
Only later did I come to discover that, the first skinheads were actually black people from Jamaica, migrant youth from Jamaica coming back to England. So now you got all these black youth and all these white youth, and they're coming together and influencing each other's style. And the white kids got exposed to the black kids' style and music, and that was the birth of ska. British ska, right? Second wave ska.
I mean, they were like British white kids and like Jamaican, Caribbean kids hanging out together, and it wasn't a big deal.
So I started to understand that was the roots of skinhead culture. So then I had, more so than the attitude, the militancy, and the style, it was like, this also comes from me. This comes from black people in the diaspora.
I'm Erin Yankee. I made a podcast with my friend Mike Crenshaw called It Did Happen Here about punks and other Portland residents fighting back against neo-Nazis in the late 80s and early 90s. This is our home. And people wanted to erase our friends and have them not exist. And fuck that. We just want to be left alone. And we weren't being left alone.
These Nazis were able to completely shut down my community. So we have a choice, right? Give up this one identity that's more important to us than anything, or to fight for it. It's neo-Nazis who forced us to become, quote unquote, political. The way we decided to start this project to defend the community from hate crimes and hate organizing was to try to understand the problem. Research at that point either meant clippings, right, from newspapers, or attending meetings, right, in person. That's how we got to know them. But there was another way we could start to get a sense by collecting flyers. They would put up hate flyers everywhere. These flyers were viscerally racist, right? Homophobic, anti-immigrant, you name it, right? Islamophobic, just vile, vile stuff. But the interesting thing is no matter how racist or how homophobic, there was always on these flyers some reference to the Jewish community, right? So there'd be a Star David, or there'd be this total anti-Semitic caricatures, right? Yarmulke, rabbi. And typically, if there was a caricature of a Jewish person, it would be like with puppet strings, right? Pulling like the strings of a puppet, right? Usually the homeless person or the gay man or the immigrant. The problem is known as the Great Replacement Theory, a retelling of a conspiracy called the Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion, a narrative that appears in the early 1900s that purports to tell the story of Jewish elders gathering in a cemetery at midnight in order to plot the takeover of European Christendom. Democracy, for those who were afraid of it, right, became nothing more than an anti-Semitic conspiracy. That poor people, right, living in feudal conditions didn't have any real grievances. They were merely being stirred up, right, by their Jewish puppet masters.
What was once a fringe white supremacist conspiracy theory has now become mainstream.
Jews will not replace us!
The Great Replacement Theory is the 2.0 retelling of the protocols in modern America.
Eric was posting articles that he had written. He was connecting the dots between white supremacists, hate, anti-Semitism. Those two have always been part of the same thing.
And so for us to stand up to that and to step up to that was a big deal. And it took a lot of learning and a lot of courage.
I think it's fascinating that my music community is really the first formation outside the Jewish community to fight anti-Semitism as a formation, right? Anti-Semitism left unchecked prevents us from addressing racism in society. Why? Because a white nationalist movement looks at the grievances of Black America, or looks at the grievances of women, or looks at the grievances of union workers, and says those aren't legitimate grievances. Those are just people being organized by a Jewish conspiracy. With one fell swoop, right? Anti-Semitism, right, denies the credibility and the legitimate grievances of people who want a better life in our society and want more opportunity. We see polls telling us nearly half of America believes there's going to be a civil war in this country in 5 years. I'm here to tell you what we're dealing with in this country, right, is exactly what happened in our subculture. The only difference is it's now happening on a mass scale. We have to do better by our communities. People are being killed. We are no longer talking about the issues that matter, right? Jobs, housing, right? Access to health. What types of lives do we want for our children? Climate. It is now all distracted by this conspiracy, right? This conspiratorial narrative that is causing irrevocable harm to the idea of a United States of America.